New York Democrats are abusing the law. This is an unprecedented case being brought against him to try to rig the election for Joe Biden. I wanted to highlight the abuses of Trump because it's kind of a readily appearance in the news, and you're not getting the full picture from the anti-Trump media. Is the Judge Engoron up in New York City, who's running this kangaroo show trial against President Trump and his companies at the behest of fellow Democrat politician Letitia James. Now, the judges up in New York are elected. So Judge Engoron is a Democrat politician who was elected as a judge. Now, that's the system of, and I'm not against the elections of judges, but we should recognize that when a judge is out of the control, as Judge Engoron is, where that's coming from. Well, he's an elected political official. So typically judges are supposed to keep that aside in the administration of justice. Judge Engoron has simply refused to do that through evidence of bias and his ridiculing and targeting and abusing of Trump. And President Trump and his legal team have been, fighting. It's like being in a Soviet trial, right? I mean, the verdict is already for a foregone conclusion in many respects. Indeed, it technically was in terms of findings by fraud even before the trial commenced that Judge Engoron found. Bogus findings of fraud, to be clear. Now, at the end of the case, the Trump attorneys filed a motion for mistrial. And you may recall Judge Engoron also had a gag order or two that he imposed on Trump to prevent Trump from criticizing his misconduct. Completely anti-constitutional. There are laws that are unconstitutional, but then there are also actions and laws that are anti-constitutional, right? And we're in the era of anti-constitutional attacks on our system of government. I mean, this is so far beyond normal discussions in terms of what's appropriate in the judiciary. And President Trump, and I'm going to read a little bit from his motion for mistrial. I posted it on Twitter. And that's the value of social media, because most people, if you're relying on the newspapers are never, and I say the newspaper, I guess no one reads newspapers anymore. News articles rarely fully cover or give a full briefing to a legal argument like Trump is making or some of the facts he's laying out here. And to be fair, it's not because they're biased, although that's true in part. It's because they only have so much space. Well, we have a little bit more space on the internet these days, and we're trying to take advantage of it here at Judicial Watch. As I say in the tweet, I've carefully reviewed Trump's motion for a mistrial in the unprecedented proceeding before Democratic Judge Engoron. The brief lays out a disturbing pattern of biased misconduct and unusual and threatening behavior by the court. And their brief opens up with the following, the Trump brief. The Constitution guarantees defendants a fair and impartial trial. Here, in an unprecedented case commanding worldwide interest and attention, it is imperative that nothing compromise that guarantee and thereby undermine public confidence in our legal system. While counsel are subject to a gag order apparently imposed to impede the issues herein presented from becoming public, it is a fundamental precept of American jurisprudence that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Indeed, the assumption that respect for the judiciary can be won by shielding judges from publishing criticism wrongly appraises the character of American opinion. And an enforced silence, however limited, solely in the name of preserving the dignity of the bench, would probably engender resentment, suspicion, and contempt much more than it would enhance respect. Well, what they're pointing out there is that Engoron essentially threatened them about filing a motion for mistrial, because the mistrial would have to, quote, talk about Engoron's misconduct, which in theory would be in violation of the gag orders. That's why they're using that language there. While the court has restricted public criticism of itself on the issues herein presented in a series of unconstitutional gag orders entered sua sponte. Sua sponte means on the court's I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the technical version of it. My general understanding of it is on the court's own power without being asked. They just did it. He just did it. The Supreme Court instructs that the operations of the courts and the judicial conduct of judges are matters of utmost public concern. Moreover, there can be no doubt of the public perception of bias in this case. Even commentators who are politically opposed to President Trump have noticed the biased nature of the proceedings and the astonishing departure from ordinary standards of impartiality. And then they quote a story from Andrew McCarthy, a writer at National Review, former prosecutor. And the quote that they have from Andy is, "The case against the former president lacks victims, so Tish James and Arthur Engoron are inventing some. Engoron keeps cutting Trump and his lawyers off by insisting that he has already decided Trump A, committed fraud, B, overvalued his assets, and C, cannot be insulated by the disclaimer in his FSCs advising counterparties to do their own due diligence in evaluating asset value." So that's kind of the heart of the dispute here. The appearance of bias threatens both defendants' rights, meaning Trump's and his companies and those others in his family being targeted here, and the integrity of the judiciary as an institution. As developed herein, in this case, the evidence of apparent and actual bias is tangible and overwhelming. Such evidence, coupled with an unprecedented departure from standard judicial procedure, has tainted these proceedings, and a mistrial is warranted. Specifically, the court's own conduct, coupled with the principal law clerk, Allison Greenfield's unprecedented role in the trial and extensive public partisan activities, would cause even a casual observer to question the court's partiality. Thus, only the grant of a mistrial can salvage what is left of the rule of law. And the brief goes on to highlight the role of Ms. Greenberg in the trial. And evidently, she's sitting literally right next to Judge Engoron. I think I posted a picture. So that's the pictures they posted from the brief. So that's the clerk sitting right next to her. Now, is that normal in New York? I don't know. I haven't been to many court hearings in New York. I don't think I've ever been to a court hearing in New York. We're usually down here in D.C., so maybe that's the typical way a clerk sits next to a judge. But it looks unusual to me. And they accuse the judge of allowing her to co-judge the case. And they say the clerk in the brief, there's evidence that the clerk is a Democratic Party activist contributor. And she made contributions in violation of the law in terms of the large volume of contributions. The court, and this is what they say about it, this court has also impermissibly exceeded the discretion in granting the principal law clerk unprecedented status and input into these proceedings and restricted the speech of anyone who seeks to comment on this status, input, and or perceived partisan bias. This court has, during the special proceeding, all pretrial proceedings and since the trial began, allowed his principal law clerk to preside on the bench with him to his right-hand side. This arrangement is depicted in the below photographs published by the Getty Images and the Associated Press, and that's what we showed you earlier. The brief also accuses the judge, and this is really interesting, I hadn't heard this before, of improper commentary and extrajudicial activity touching on the case. So evidently he runs some type of alumni newsletter for his high school, and some folks have noted he posted some pictures of himself exercising, whatever, showing that he's buff and such. That wasn't necessarily the ethical issue. The ethical issue, in my view, is his behavior on the bench, plus the what he seems to be doing here, which I didn't know about previously. What he's been doing is posting links to stories critical of Trump and the witnesses, and obviously taking strong stances on the case in his capacity as a judge. Well, I don't even know if it's the capacity as a judge. Is it his personal capacity? I mean, ethically, he's responsible for that type of behavior. I've never seen anything like that. A judge just posting a bunch of stories, you know, that put the defendant that's currently before him in a bad light, and include commentary and description of his cases that, you know, have no business being promoted or pushed by a judge. This is what they say about that. The court has contravened the code of judicial conduct and created the appearance of impropriety through publicly commenting on a proceeding before him. The court, in his capacity as a Wheatley School alumnus, I guess that's his high school, has publicly posted links in the Wheatley newsletter he maintains to articles disparaging parties in council, including Eric Trump, President Trump, Ms. Haba, who's one of the lawyers, and Cushman and Wakefield, and covering his own decisions in derogation of the code, which the site is, a judge shall not make any public comment about a pending or impending proceeding in any court within the United States or its territories. So is posting stories a public comment? I would argue it probably is. And then they go on to list, I'm not going to read all the stories they posted. I mean, he posted a story that President Trump lost an appeal, about his contempt orders against witnesses. Really strange things for him to be posting. Wildly inappropriate in my view. And then the brief also accuses the judge of bias in the gag order, which was an unprecedented, and I think, violative of the Constitution attack, anti-constitutional attack on Trump. The gag orders and the enforcement thereof reveal the court has christened itself Camera Stellata, judge, jury, and executioner, proceeding, quote, sua sponte, to act against President Trump in violation of the Constitution, the judiciary law, and the First Department rules. And that's state and judicial rules in New York. The Star Chamber approach is particularly defensible when the gag orders actually shield the court itself from public criticism and perceived bias. This court's efforts to silence counsel from objecting to and creating a record of what anyone could observe publicly taking place in the courtroom during the trial thus painfully augment the appearance of impropriety. So the judge didn't want Trump's lawyers raising for the record that the first principal clerk, is that the title? I think that's the title. His top clerk sitting right next to him was engaged in this back and forth with him in a way that was distracting in the trial and raised questions about who was running the show there. I mean, the law is the elected judge is supposed to be running the show, not an unelected bureaucrat who works for him. Now, Judge Engoron says, I've got an absolute right to consult with my clerks any way I want, and you can't second guess it. And I don't think that's true. I mean, he certainly has discretion there, but obviously there's a line that could be stepped over by Engoron. And sure enough, they're complaining about the gag orders in this mistrial brief. And the appellate court, thankfully, an appellate court judge above Engoron temporarily lifted the gag order. And in the filing, she wrote, I think it was a she, the judge, the gag orders were lifted, and the judge said, considering the constitutional statutory rights at issue, an interim stay is granted. So they kind of said to the judge that, Judge Engoron, there are constitutional issues to what you've done here, and we're going to have to figure it out. So big victory for Trump in that regard. So there you have it. Now, is Judge Engoron going to give Trump the mistrial ruling he seeks? I don't think so. Now, they could. I presume they could appeal that. But I didn't know some of this, right? Certainly about Judge Engoron's activities. And I kind of was vaguely aware about the weirdness of the clerk and the judge sitting there together and kind of seemingly co-judging. But to see some more significant descriptions in the brief is enlightening. And I don't know if this mistrial proceeding is going to proceed, this mistrial case, request is going to be granted. I suspect it won't be. And I don't even know legally, and this is where the lawyers can all opine, and they all pretend to know everything about. I just love how lawyers online tend to know everything about the law, no matter their limited expertise or limits on practice. They seem to pretend to know everything about the law. So I'm interested in the lawyers online who seem to know everything about the law, telling us whether they think this mistrial request is going to proceed or be successful. But it's, as I noted in the beginning, the outcome of the mistrial, whether there's a mistrial or not, is only part of the issue. The brief itself, I think, powerfully describes the kangaroo-style court operation that's going on there up in New York against Trump. And this is an important case. Trump is a candidate for president of the United States, the #1 candidate under the polls right now. He's a former president of the United States. And it's clear to me that New York Democrats are abusing the law. This is an unprecedented case being brought against him to try to rig the election for Joe Biden or retaliate against him for his First Amendment speech by destroying his company. Because if they get their way, they could end his company, practically speaking. What better way to strike a blow for Joe Biden's campaign than to destroy the personal wealth, which is significant, of his #1 opponent? As I've said previously, and I think it's worth reminding, that how is it you judge whether there's something legit going on in terms of charging President Trump? Well, first of all, I think you see, has there ever been charges like this before? Are the charges novel? Is the law, even if it's a technical violation of the law, they've ever been brought charges like this before? Has the law ever been interpreted this way to apply to the conduct at issue? And that's not, and you'll see in actually every targeting of Trump by Democrat politicians here in Washington, D.C., in Fulton County, up in New York City. Don't forget you got Soros-backed prosecutor Alvin Bragg trying to jail Trump as well. You'll find that it's a novel application of the law that's never been pursued before and arguably is unconstitutional, anti-constitutional, etc., and just purely retaliatory. So these aren't cases like Trump was caught, doing something obviously illegal like robbing a bank in plain sight. No, he was engaged in First Amendment disputes of elections, so let's try to jail him for that. They're arguing with him about valuations of properties, as Andy McCarthy has said, when there have been no complaints about such valuations of properties. And everyone was happy in all those transactions, et cetera, et cetera. This is the worst corruption in American history, the targeting of Trump, the abuse of Trump. It's been ongoing from the moment, I would argue probably before he ran for president or announced officially, and it continues to this day. So that's terrible corruption up in New York. Who's running New York? Why is the Attorney General's office getting federal funds if that's what they're using it for? Right? Is Congress going to shut down funding for the Attorney General of New York? The civil rights abusers up in New York? They should. I'll just close with this. There's a big case in Fulton County. A federal court judge has allowed claims to proceed to trial concerning the security of the Dominion court system, the Dominion voting system that Georgia uses to run elections. And the court presented, in just letting the claims go to trial, which is a significant move, evidence that the system can be gamed. So that's the summary. I'm going to get into more details the next time we visit. So, but in the meantime, so that's a big deal. And I encourage you to look it up in the meantime. I have a great tweet on it. Maybe we can have a link to the tweet below, and we'll follow up next time we're together again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.